Thank you everyone for joining. So just a quick recap of the day. So we started with this is a big data breakout room. We started talking about the products we're launching, the tools we have out in the market. We've talked about customer use cases and minimum viable products and minimum viable product team and how we can all work together. So this kind of dovetails into the other side of the equation, which is with great responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility. So Nicole from our team is going to lead a panel on talking about how we can innovate and be privacy compliant and respectful of the ethical treatment of data and all that good stuff. Three housekeeping items. First one is, if you have any questions for the panel, please put them in the discussion tab within the app, within the actual session. So you can post those, and they can be anonymous. So the mobile app game code for this session is 3916. And then finally, sorry Nicole to spring this on you, but we might have a bit of a hard stop at 3:25-ish because we invite you all to come to the main stage and hear Mike Branch's keynote about data and analytics. So we want to give everybody some time to get over there. So 3:25-ish is when we'll conclude this session. I'll turn it over to you, Nicole. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I know privacy is a hot topic in California these days, and certainly one that keeps all of us up here on the stage quite busy as part of our day today. But really, the point of the discussion today is really to open up the dialogue and have an informal chat with some key thought leaders and experts that I've had the privilege of knowing over the course of my career, and also have had an opportunity to work with on a variety of fronts in their organizations respectively as we build out Geotab's privacy and big data portfolio as well. And I've had the privilege as well over the last 2 days to actually walk through and meet so many amazing people under this roof, and an incredible amount of innovation that's taking place within the telematics space that I think is incredibly well represented here at Connect this year. And as a result of that, what I wanted to do with this discussion here today is really to continue to extend that conversation around innovation. And traditionally, as we think about privacy, and as I'm sure I'm going to get a few smiles from folks here in the room, privacy tends to be a bit of a juxtaposition or a polarized view when we're talking about innovation, right? So privacy tends to be the fun police, or at least traditionally that is how it's been perceived. When it comes to going to market quickly with insights, being able to deliver robust data products and solutions in a timely fashion. And what we want to do here with the discussion today is to really change that paradigm of thinking, to really think about introducing privacy as an enabler of innovation. And so I'm going to let my colleagues here today, who again I've had the privilege of working with and having some extensive discussions with over the course of my career at Geotab, to really open up the conversation around what Geotab is doing, but the industry more broadly, and forecasting some of those innovative insights and ideas that what we're hoping to see unfold as the privacy journey in 2020 reveals itself within the telematics, automotive, and fleet management space. So joining me here on the stage today, and I have the privilege of just moderating the discussion, so really just keeping things moving. I think the really important content that you guys will be taking away from the session today is really the insights that will be coming from the chat. That is going to be a lot more broad than just the Geotab universe. That being said, I also have to make sure that I caveat the discussion today to suggest that there's no legal opinion or to construe any of the discussion points here today as legal opinion. And to also not think of them as representation of our respective organizations, including Geotab as well. So these are personal opinion, and we want to make sure that we're having an open dialogue, because I think part of the conversation around privacy and changing that paradigm is integral to innovation, but also making sure that we're thinking about an honest conversation around privacy and what that means within a big data context. So I'll let Nicole open up the discussion first. Maybe just do a quick bio, 1 or 2 minutes just describing yourself, your organization, and your role. And then I'll extend it to both Nathan and Monica as well.
Well, thanks, Nicole. I'm Nicole Davenport. I'm a senior manager with Deloitte in our privacy practice. I'm based out of our Atlanta office, but I've been spending a lot of time here in California, getting people ready for the California Privacy Act. Before that, I spent too much time in Europe getting people ready for the General Data Protection Act. I do a lot of work within the automotive industry, working with OEMs, with dealers, a variety of different people or companies within the eco structure of or ecosystem of privacy and automotive. So this is a really exciting opportunity. I find it a really, really exciting area because it's very dynamic. Right now with what all of you are doing with pulling the data, and as you said, the juxtaposition between what the privacy laws are, I think is super exciting. She said, I don't give legal advice, but I did practice law for 20 years before switching over to Deloitte. Many of those years as a class action attorney, so I'm kind of aware of a lot of different risks, litigation, potential things that we're going to be seeing in the privacy space. So look forward to answering any questions you guys have at the end and talking to you today.
Thank you for joining us, Nicole.
Hi, I'm Nathan Good. I'm the principal at Good Research. Also, I teach at Cal Berkeley, north of here, but we can all still be friends. The thing that really gets me excited is taking this concept of privacy and figuring out how to make it work in an engineering and data science context. This has really been something that's taken on a lot of interest in the past couple of years with the advent of GDPR, CCPA, and numerous other policies that are coming in. But my engineering's in background, my background is in engineering, and really trying to figure out how do we make these two work together is really what drives and motivates me and the people who work with us.
Welcome. Monica?
Yeah, I'm Monica Holbrook. I'm the CEO of Cryptonumerix. Our company is basically a data privacy company where we're really focused on being able to unlock the value of data safely. So that means you're still able to privacy protect that data, become compliant with regulations, but still be able to generate the insights that you would like to have. A lot of customers that we talk to aren't aware that that ability is still there and that you can still generate that analytical value. And to be able to do it in a safe way is really what we're focused on. We're very excited to be at this conference because telematics is just an incredible industry. The treasure trove of data is amazing. It also has a lot of identifying information, and the spatial temporal especially is very interesting to us. So yes, we're excited to continue working in this space.
Thank you for joining us at Connect this year. Really appreciate it. So that kind of segues, I think Monica's done a great job sort of surmising some of the main trends that we're seeing, at least in the regulatory space, that's driving some of the innovation around protection of data, and specifically personal data belonging to our customers, our drivers, et cetera. And you know, there are a lot of reasons why privacy is increasingly an important topic that most of our respective organizations are grappling with in one way or another. And we're seeing, you know, a huge plethora of change happening within the regulatory landscape with a bulk of legislative changes happening across the US, as everyone here probably knows. I think at last count, there was over 20 states in the US that are all either thinking about or have adopted some localized privacy policies or privacy laws that are currently being considered or tabled. We're seeing a huge amount of change happening as a result of GDPR in Europe, which is the EU legislation regulating EU members, member entities. And then also in Canada last year, we also had an update to our breach notification laws that makes it mandatory for breaches to be reported to our Federal Privacy Commission for those industries and organizations that are subject to that legislation. So that's all to say that we are in a climate of change, right? And a climate of change usually also means a climate for innovation to take place as well. And I think we're at a nexus point, and a very important nexus point, where we're thinking about, you know, why are some of the reasons, or what are some of the rationale for why the automotive industry would care about privacy today, and specifically in the context of the telematics space. So with that in mind, I'm going to open up that first question to you, Monica, or Nicole.
It should be easy, Nicole.
It should be easy to you, Nicole, as to what are some of the important rationale for why this sector should care.
Okay, well, this sector started caring back in 2016 when the Automobile Alliance adopted a fair number of privacy principles. They're based on the fair information privacy principles that were issued by the Federal Trade Commission Federal Trade Commission here in the United States. They are pretty basic. They are data transparency. What do you have about me? What are you doing with me? Consent or choice. I want you or don't want you to be able to do this about me. Safety, data security. So if you're going to take my data, you better be secure about it. Purpose limitation. So if you're getting my data about me, don't do anything else with it. And that's very tricky in this space. And then data integrity, making sure that the data you're entrusted with remains accurate, safe, detailed. Also another problem in the telematics industry, because when you start thinking about it and you start thinking about vehicles, who knows who's driving that vehicle? I was telling them, I've got 2 kids in college. I own the cars, they drive the cars. If I provide information and consent and say, okay, you can do all of this stuff with my information, does that mean when one of my kids hops behind the wheels, they have the same consent given? Are you collecting information about minors in any of the things you're doing? Luckily, you guys are B2B, consumer. You're probably not hiring many 15-year-olds. But if you were, you would need a special level of consent from their parents or from them, depending on which country you're in. So this is something that is evolving. It's been around since the 2016s in this industry. But it's really changed with the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, CCPA, because the definition of data has changed so dramatically. We used to think of, our personal information, phone book information, our credit card numbers, our banking information, anything, my driver's license number. If you could steal my identity, then that was my personal information. Well, now it's not. It's anything that relates to an identified or identifiable human being. All right, so can you get identifiable human being information from all of the systems that you're using? Maybe, probably. The great thing about it, and I think you'll talk about it, is that when you start getting to anonymized data, de-identified data, that's a lot of data that can still be used. But if it's data that gets down to the individual level, that's when different protections need to be in place. So as the technology evolves, there are a lot of things that you don't think about traditionally in PII, like geolocation data, which can be the subject of a data subject request under GDPR or CCPA. And do you give that to somebody? What are the safety ramifications of giving somebody their geolocation data? So there are a lot of things that are coming up that as the industry is evolving, that these privacy issues should be baked in from the beginning. So privacy by design was called out by specificity in the GDPR. I think all of you are familiar with security by design. It's a matter of marrying those two together as we go forward.
That's excellent. And I think some of the new exciting use cases that we are seeing even here at Connect, being showcased as a result of that nexus point between new types of data that we can collect to gather insights from, but also the way that it can be used to foster innovation as well. And we're also seeing the legislative landscape evolving and changing, I think, as well, because of the new paradigms and new opportunities to cultivate new use cases for that data. That being said, maybe it would be just really helpful, and I'll open it up to both Monica and Nathan, maybe to just give an overview of the types of data that we're seeing collected by vehicles today, just to give it a little bit of context.
Cool. Want to go first?
Okay. Well, I'm probably preaching to the choir here if they're all your customers, but yeah, I mean, you name it, your car stores it. I mean, it has more information than your smartphone. It knows where you go, when you go, how fast you go. It's keeping track of everything inside your vehicle. It's keeping track of the weather. It's keeping track of, if you're connecting your phone, as Nicole had mentioned, it's keeping track of who you're calling. It knows your contacts. If you're actually storing any information into your map, that it's also retaining that information in the car itself as well. I'm sure Nathan has some other examples.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important from an engineering perspective, just out of curiosity, how many people here consider themselves a developer? No? Okay. How many people have heard of privacy engineering before they came here today? Nice. Yeah, I think part of the challenge of now being a developer and having to think about privacy considerations is just the extensive amount of information that falls under what Nicole was saying as personal. Yeah. And that can be really, really challenging, especially for the developer mindset, because you're thinking, well, okay, if I'm collecting, telemetry information in this one case, and then I'm merging it with this other information, and I have root information. Is that really personal? And under the law, you're supposed to figure out how to protect that. And one of the biggest challenges then is like, what is it that is personal before you decide how to protect it? And it's not easy. And the laws don't do a very good job of telling you what that is. And so it really comes down to a lot of the people who are implementing this data, who really understand the data, which is really on the burden of the data scientists and the engineers to really come up with a good understanding of what could be personal and communicate this to the people who are in charge of it. And from there, then you have the next challenge. It was like, well, how do I implement the protections around it? Which makes telematics in the space that you guys are in both fascinating and challenging at the same time.
And so I think you raise a good point around sort of that nexus or bridge between sort of engineering concepts and privacy. And I think a lot of that, in my experience, has been a reflection of legislative and regulatory framework that you know, is built to answer the what and why, but not necessarily the how. And I think some of the secret sauce and some of the competitive advantage associated with being able to do cool things with big volumes of data, but also doing it in a way that protects the interest of our consumers, our customers, and our drivers, is figuring out the how. So maybe just given your experience and the role that you've played in the privacy engineering space, Nathan, maybe you can just give a quick overview of what privacy engineering is and how it makes it real.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because privacy engineering is a relatively new concept. And if we think about the way that people have been talking about things that overlap with privacy, they've really been coming at it from the security context. So a lot of the way that people think about privacy engineering is it an extension of security? And there's ways about it that are very different. For example, this notion of personal information and your obligation to steward that information and treat it with kid gloves is really important. And the tools that we have in play for that range from process, the process that you develop for your developers, including in the agile space or in other development scenarios. There's also tools that people may be aware of, such as anonymization techniques. There's also secure programming techniques, but there's also these nuances to the privacy problem that really require engineers to think about it in slightly different ways. And one of the ways that comes up a lot is this question of context. The context that this data is being used and the context that you're going to be using this information could change your obligation to protect it a lot. And that's something that in the security space, I have a background in security, we don't really necessarily think about. We sort of think that, okay, this is the stuff we want to protect, and let's build walls around it, or let's make sure it's hard to get into. Whereas in privacy, the context of usage could change that and changes your obligation to protect it.
And over dinner last night, Monica, you gave me sort of an overview of the journey of Cryptonumerix and the fact that there was this business problem where we know that there's this vast amount of insight and value that can be delivered when being able to actually extrapolate insights from data once it's been aggregated and anonymized. But to do that on scale, right, and not reactive is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. So I'd be interested to sort of get your vantage point as to sort of the solution approach, the business solution approach that Cryptonumerix has taken, and how privacy engineering has sort of helped the journey for Cryptonumerix.
Yeah, so the approach that we've taken is, it's looking at, it's not, the security is important, right? Like you have to have that. The business process has to be in place. You need to know where the data is. You need to be able to map it, discover it, track it, know what it's being used for. You need to have cybersecurity in place, but that's killing the value of the data. And so what we're doing is our anonymization and de-identification, as well as our privacy-preserving machine learning, enables the ability to access that data without exposing the personal information and doing the analytics on top. And you can put it in a pipeline. So you have your data coming in, your data sources, and you can go ahead and apply the privacy before it goes into your analytics environment, or you can put it on a consumption basis. And so you have your raw data, and as you consume data sets, you apply privacy before a data scientist starts working with it. But you want to, as you know, right, as you mentioned, the data scientist probably knows the data best. right? And they know how private it is. And but at the same time, you don't want to give them the keys to the kingdom, because at the end of the day, they really want all the data raw if they can get it. But that is also potentially very identifying. So you need to kind of balance that with the privacy risk compliance people and making sure that you're meeting both sides of the business, whether it's the analytical results or the privacy controls, to make sure that you're protecting your customers.
Yeah, so this idea of balancing context and utility is certainly a very important one, specifically when we're talking about geolocation data as well, right?
Yes.
You know, how far is far enough for it to be aggregated or anonymized, and kind of answering that question.
Yeah, and it's a hard question to answer, right? Because, you know, regulators are really not giving us any answers. It's very vague. GDPR, even though it's been enacted for a year and a half now, right?
Pushing 2.
Yeah, it's still, that people are still wondering what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to be doing it. It would be great if they could just, you know, nail it out, but it is context-based. And then also it does depend on the risk level that companies are comfortable with, and then different data sets present different risks, and then it goes to linking, right? Like as we get into the world of IoT and all the different types of data that's out there, besides just what's in your car, but now let's connect that with publicly available data. Now we've just made that a really interesting data set.
Yeah. I mean, like a good example is Nicole brought up earlier today from a talk from the law enforcement community. And so in a lot of ways, the privacy engineering goal and the data scientist goal are very aligned. So the great example that Nicole was pointing to was you're a emergency responder and you're monitoring traffic information in a certain part of the, you know, your city. And you can have people whose job is to go very, very fast to save people, skew that data set. And if you don't understand that, and you're consuming this information, you're putting it into your model, suddenly your model doesn't really work very more, and you can make bad inferences on it. So if there's a certain emergency thoroughfare and lots of emergencies or vehicles are going, you could kind of lean down the road and say, well, wow, there's a lot of people speeding, so we should make it harder for cars to go, and then you would actually impact the ability for an emergency vehicle to actually get someplace. And that understanding of context actually really comes into play with when you're thinking about privacy. So you can imagine, for example, even from a safety perspective, that if you want to sever these kind of relationships in that specific instance, you say, okay, well, we're going to separate out the emergency vehicles, treat them differently than the normal vehicles. Well, then what sort of information are you imparting to people about the routes of first responders and emergency responders? So there's these kind of complex questions that start to arise as you start to understand the data and start to pull it more, which are still very, very germane and part of what the way the data scientist thinks already.
Yeah. I mean, and if you think about data mitigation, you know, as being an important part as well, I mean, going back to data scientists, they could look at, you know, all the data that they have, but they may not need half of it, which means they could just remove it from their data set, but they wouldn't know that until they actually started playing with it and figuring out that, like, okay, yeah, you know, and that would completely reduce the risk of that data set.
Yeah, so like one customer that we worked with was interested in retail analytics. And retail analytics, for example, you can have very, very precise information that can be very personal about it. But if all you're really concerned about is, you know, aggregate movement of people over certain time periods, then that's the level of fidelity of information that you need to collect and use. And that's in keeping with kind of the purpose of the law and the use of it. And those types of, you know, connecting the end results and the end uses to the collection and the building of your models is a core part of what a data scientist can add to the privacy engineering conversation.
Yeah, and I will add that that becomes important from the regulatory side, because you mentioned inferences. There are a lot of inferences that go on, and under CCPA, an inference is something you've got to be able to provide to the data subject. So if you're keeping it at the aggregate level of what you were discussing, great, protected, not going to be an impact. But if you are actually knowing that it is a particular ambulance and Nicole happens to have gotten a new career and is driving that ambulance and you know it's Nicole, all bets are off. I mean, that's a privacy problem, and that's the level of data that needs to be protected to the higher level. That's the level of data that would have to be provided in response to an individual's data subject request. So how do you do that when you're building? Does the engineer know that, okay, if we are going to the data subject level, to the data element level, because we actually need that, then do we know where it is? Can we get it? Can we put our fingers on it? Is it protected? Are the right elements protected? Because obviously you're not going to protect everything the same, but figuring out what the riskiest part of that data is and doing that risk ranking that Monica brought up becomes very important for the way you build it. And if you're thinking about it at the beginning, it's going to be much easier than if you think about it and retroactively try to put some privacy protections in to meet the requirements.
And bake it in as part of the privacy by design principles.
Privacy by design.
Yeah, and GDPR is now entrenched privacy by design as a construct, proactive construct within its legislation as well. And you know, we're seeing a big push. And I think just given this audience and the type of work that we're doing and the, you know, the plethora of sort of agile development activities that are happening and integrating with you know, some of the engineering work, even on the data science side, you know, there's certainly an opportunity, I think, within this industry to start baking into some of those engineering constructs and aligning that with privacy. So that being said, I mean, you know, what I found really exciting for the work that Cryptonumerix is doing and good research is the idea as well of taking big data and using it to actually help improve innovation and protecting personal data in new and exciting ways. So Nathan, maybe as a starting point would be great, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the work that your team does around motivated intruder attack scenarios and, and how you know, sort of you're building models, being able to do de-identification and re-identification work in order to alleviate some of the concerns around aggregated and anonymized data.
Yeah, absolutely. So to the other Nicole's part, when she was talking about anonymization as a strategy, right? So a lot of the regulations say anonymize your data. And a lot of privacy engineers or even developers in your company will say, well, how? Like, how do I know I've done it right? You know, do I just take it and, you know, swap everybody's name with Kermit the Frog? Like, does that work? Or do I have to do something a lot more ambitious? What is that level? You know, how good is it, right? And a lot of this is not something that people are generally trained with. They don't really understand it very well. So like Monica's company does an excellent job of taking that information and applying anonymization techniques on it so you can still get utility at the end of it. What we do is we look at people's anonymized data sets and really can tell you how well you've done a good job. And that's also based off of the threat model and the risk model. So in some cases, if you're not that concerned about a certain data, so say for example, you know, again, context matters, you're anonymizing root information. And you could be anonymizing root information because you need to share it with the customer, and the customer says, hey, you're contractually obligated to anonymize the root information so that we can, you know, use it and share it. You're like, sure. So you go Google anonymization, you find some tools, and you run it. And you know, the risk is that that person's competitors can really understand a lot of the details about the root information. So how do you know that that can't happen? So that's the sort of service that we provide people, is really kind of helping people walk through that anonymization process and understand the level of risk they have associated with the details they have, and also help them to build that into their engineering process.
Now, I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, but I don't think technology alone is enough when we're talking about making it real. So I'm going to actually turn over the conversation to Nicole to maybe talk a little bit about governance and the importance of change leadership and change management within an organization in terms of adoption.
Oh gosh, this is the battle I fight all the time trying to help clients. Privacy is the hot potato. Nobody wanted privacy when GDPR happened. No, legal's like, oh, I'll take it. No, you know, I don't want it. Compliance doesn't want it. IT doesn't want it. The CIO doesn't want it. We don't have a privacy officer. There's no privacy office. Nobody wanted privacy. I think most companies are to a point where they realize that there's got to at least be somebody aligned to privacy and to making sure that all of these things that you need are having. And I want to say, even non-anonymized data, you can use it with consent. So don't think all bets are off. Like, right. Data is still available. You just need to let people know what data you are getting or you're taking from them, why you are taking it from them, who you are sharing it with. And that, to get on top of that, it becomes very difficult. And data governance is the way that moves in. So now we're seeing a lot of data governance, which brings in its own set of technologies and tools, trying to figure out and look at the data element and what data is it that we have, where it is across the organization, how do we treat it. There are a couple of different data governance models or privacy governance models that say, whether it's everybody's duty within the business. You've got privacy stewards who are adopted everywhere across the business, or it's just centralized in one place. That one place that probably doesn't want to have it separate or have the responsibility for doing it. So getting governance into the company is a multi-hurdle process. One, you've got to get buy-in from somebody to give the budget for data governance. Then you've got to get people across the organization to go ahead and buy into data governance and say, all right, I am going to take that responsibility. I am going to bring up privacy when nobody else is bringing it up for me. I am going to start getting in the process. I don't know if any of you guys have been involved in privacy impact assessments. I know that when my security question comes up that I need to bring up, hey, where are the privacy questions? Where am I thinking about that? And then putting that all in one place where the information can be organized. Trying to get that done is not an overnight process. We say the change management for that probably is a good 2 years within the organization once the commitment. And you're laughing, you think 2 years is ambitious? I sometimes think 2 years is ambitious. It's really got to be grassroots to make it embedded, which is the whole purpose of privacy by design. And I was talking to one of my colleagues earlier on the auto team, and he was reminding me of a slide I have called "It Takes a Village." And really what that means is it's not just IT's responsibility. It's also human resources, because you're going to have a lot of information about your fleet drivers and what are they doing, and are they providing the drivers with the information so that the drivers can give consent for all of this information to be used, whether it's down to the personal level or to the anonymized level. So there are just a lot of different things that have to be built in over time, and data governance is where we're going. Tools for data governance are definitely the future of privacy.
And given the amount of change that an organization has to adopt in terms of implementation of process, technology investments, new paradigms around privacy engineering, and we're talking about large volumes of data, but also a lot of change that's happening on the technology side, data and analytics as an industry. How is the regulatory environment changing, and do we foresee any changes in the regulatory landscape in the next little while?
Yeah, so the regulatory landscape only keeps growing. Everybody knew GDPR was coming. There was a 2-year deadline. The CCPA came out of nowhere. It was a surprise. It was supposed to be on a ballot initiative. The legislature got pretty smart and realized that if it's on the ballot and everybody in California votes for that privacy law, it's in the Constitution, it's not going to be changeable. So they came up with a law in about 3 weeks. That law, now called the US GDPR, is the basis for a number of other legislative proposals. So this year we had Nevada that passed information about data brokers. So if you guys are starting to take all of this data, ingest it, it's down to a data level or a human level, and you're selling it, you're a data broker. All of a sudden there's a whole bunch of extra requirements that you have to follow. So the data broker laws, Nevada and I believe Vermont is the other one who has the data broker laws. Washington State got through their House a privacy law that was a little bit more stringent than CCPA last year. It died in the Senate because the Washington State Senate didn't think it was strict enough on privacy, because Microsoft was very involved in trying to try to get that passed. Most people expect that Washington State's going to have its privacy law passed this year in 2020. New York got very close last year. New York has their proposed law makes data companies that hold data fiduciaries. You're a fiduciary to the people whose data you hold. That's a really high standard that you're going to have. If that actually makes it through the legislature, that throws a lot of the work that was done for CCPA and GDPR up in the wind to figure out how you're going to deal with fiduciary. Is your company's CEO, CPO ready to sign off on an attestation like they do on the SOX and say, yes, we are privacy compliant? And in addition to the different state laws, I think last year there were 27 states that had proposed laws. There are about 10, 14 different versions in front of our Congress who are thinking about how to homogenize the different state laws and make one standard. Some people are very bullish about that. I personally am not bullish about that. I think just like we do in data breach, we see every different state, Canada, every different country, they've got their own data breach laws. I think we're going to keep seeing every single state with their own privacy laws. And the question for our clients is, when is that the critical mass that you just change everything? CCPA got a lot of people there because you changed everything for GDPR. Now CCPA, you take the next step, little tweaks, but most people in the US are only providing those rights to Californians. Well, what happens when it's California and New York and Washington and Florida? Do you just say, okay, floodgates are open, we're going to give data subject rights to everybody? And then how do you do that? Has that been baked into your process? It should get baked into your process now, because that day is coming. So why wait till the end to retrofit? Start thinking about it with the engineering, which I'm sure is exactly what you guys are telling all of your clients.
So with that in mind, just given the amount of change and anticipated change in the regulatory landscape, that's still a bit of an unknown, at least in the US, how important is it to actually work, sort of collectively to build a defensible position within your organization as to what that standard is?
So there's a lowest common denominator. I started out by talking about the fair information principles, the ones that the automobile industry adopted a number of years ago. If you look at every global regulation, every state regulation, everything you're seeing, those core principles are the same. Consent, transparency, data minimization, use limitations. So if you can get a program that at least touches those, then you get to what we call a defensible position. I am not giving you legal advice. I am not telling you you have to do anything minimal. But I mean, look at those, and you know that we always look at it as the 80-20 rule. 80% of the laws or 80% of the requirements in those are going to get you to compliance, or at least a defensible position on compliance globally. Then figure out which are the outliers, what are the over and aboves, and are you in that marketplace? Because the laws are different depending on your marketplace, and you are probably in many marketplaces around the globe. So what is the extra? We talked earlier, I was doing something for a client yesterday. They're in Austria. Well, Austria's requirements are a little bit higher than the rest of the EU. So you do a program that's good for the EU, and then you look at your Austrian business processes and see if you need to tweak a little bit above. And that's the standard that most companies are going to now with the evolving regulation, is let's build the core. Let's build the core to the general principles, and then let's tweak as each new thing happens. And it's far easier to tweak than it was the first time around.
Excellent. And in terms of some of the gaps that we're seeing in the legislative environment today as to the how, are we seeing an influx of industry standards, best practices, standards organizations like CSA, IEEE, ISO coming out with anything new or anything on the horizon as well to try to help bridge that information gap that exists today?
I think certainly in the standards organizations that we're aware of, like for example, IEEE in 2018 wrote a letter saying, hey, privacy engineering is really cool, you guys should do it. And ISO has started a group now where they're exploring privacy engineering sort of standards. I think for the people in this audience, that means that this is not going away, and it's something to start to consider in your process. In terms of best practices, I mean, I really like Nicole's point of, there's 4 or 5 core key things that you need to understand around privacy, that all of these best practices and all of the FIPS, for example, and even like GDPR, they all kind of say the same thing. And if you can get that done in your technical process fairly well, you're in good shape. But the how has really been left up to the engineers. And this is the tricky part, because we don't have a lot of examples, and we don't have as many tools as we need, and we certainly don't have as many privacy engineers as we need. And so I'm really hoping that in the next year or two, we start to see these standards bodies, as they start to evolve, really push for people to have more examples. And also to allow the industry to feel safe enough sharing examples. We've worked with some amazing people who've just done fantastic implementations on privacy, and we can't get them to talk about it. Because they're like, I don't want my customers to think about privacy. I want them to see our product. I want them to think about how delightful the product experience is. And so really kind of getting it okay to talk about those privacy experiences and coupling that with the delight of the product that you have, I think is a real challenge, and something that hopefully the standard bodies, by kind of making it more okay to talk about, can push forward.
Yeah, that's an important point, I think, to make, is that industry groups are now starting to come together to have an increased amount of conversation specifically around this space. Are there any industry groups that we're aware of today that are actually starting to merge that conversation with the telematics space? And I'm happy to open it up to any of the panelists, like W3C or Auto ISAC.
Well, yeah, Auto ISAC. I spoke last year. They just had it this year at Toyota. There's just regularly privacy on the agenda, and there's no choice. I mean, obviously, the relationship between security and privacy is always going to be interrelated. It has to be. The trouble you are going to get in is when there is a breach. If there is a breach, and it's not if, it's when, that's when any of your bad practices regarding data are all of a sudden going to be exposed. So I am not saying that you can ignore your privacy practices if you have great data protection and data security, but data security is your first defense to a strong privacy program. So they definitely interplay with each other, and we're definitely seeing more and more alignment with different security organizations like that. I mean, you mentioned ISO, NIST now has its privacy standards as well. So yeah, I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon.
Yeah, yeah. And I think as the industry evolves and data and analytics and technologies and tools, but also the volumes of data and the way we're connecting vehicles to the internet like never before, you know, we're unearthing new use cases from the insights that we're getting as well, right? So, you know, it's interesting to see a lot of the change that's emerging. And even 5 years ago, I think, Nathan, you and I were speaking about this earlier, you know, privacy engineering as a discipline didn't even exist. And now we're seeing best practice standards being rolled out in this space. And it really being adopted as a baseline for many organizations. How important do you think consumer trust is to the conversation around privacy and privacy engineering?
It's pretty important.
Yeah.
At least one of the enterprises that we've been talking to, I mean, that's everything for them, right? Because they're a bank. I mean, and so really what does a bank sell? But they sell trust. And so if they don't have that, they don't have a business. And so they have to make sure that they preserve that. And so they're very, very conscious about privacy and what they're doing. But at the same time, they're collecting massive amounts of data, and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. And not just from an analytics side, but, you know, okay, so do we do everything on-prem and just have these massive servers? And it's just kind of, it's untenable, right? Especially when there's amazing cloud providers that can do it for you. But then how do I get it up there? How do I put my data there, and how do I make it safe, and how do I make sure I put the processes in place? Now I've just expanded my risks. So now what do I do, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean.
And how do you get it out of there?
Yeah.
You know, with data minimization and data retention.
Yeah, right. Like, so it's a huge problem, an integration problem, but it's also, you know, if you can properly put in all the processes that you need, as well as, you know, the de-identification, you can reduce that risk significantly.
And so given that complexity, how important is it for, you know, technologists, lawyers, data scientists, you know, data engineers, all to come together and basically have a cohesive strategy around privacy, specifically within a big data context? Yeah,
no, I mean, that's the biggest problem. And with this bank that we've been talking to, it's trying to get all those different stakeholders to the table, right? So you have to get the risk person, and then the compliance person, the security person, the IT person, the privacy person, the analytics person, and then the business person. Like, okay, I want to use this data because I want to, you know, I want to market to my customers this new product. I want to understand. Okay, so now you got to go talk to like 6 different people within the organization. And so if you can come up with a privacy engineering approach, and you can, you know, streamline that process. But it's definitely a paradigm shift for most organizations.
Indeed. And go ahead, Nathan.
Oh yeah, I mean the way that we've kind of seen it is there's kind of 3 layers of defense. So if you start from the back, you have audit, and then you have sort of looking over it or analyzing it, and then you also have implementation. And if everything can't be trusted unless it's an audit side, so if somebody's saying, hey, you know, how are you using data, this kind of gets back to the point that Nicole was making about governance, and you have to always go to that audit step, or you have to always go to that step where you're reviewing that information, it's just going to slow the entire process down, and it makes innovation hard to do. So when you push things into the innovation context, you actually speed up your ability to roll products out by a lot.
And that's a fair point as well that you raised around audit, Nathan, which is something that we haven't seen now that we're seeing standards coming out that are bringing, you know, engineering concepts, technical controls, and actually defining them. Are we seeing an increased ability now within a big data and analytics context to start auditing those processes and technical controls for effectiveness in new ways?
That's to me?
Yes.
Darn it, that's a hard one. That's really difficult. The audit capabilities, yeah, there's a lot to say about that because, you know, it kind of goes back to that old adage of who's going to watch the watchers, right? So you can have so much data that talks about your process, but if you don't have a good way of understanding and parsing that data, then you really don't have an audit process. And then do you have you know, good stewardship of that audit process, and you have good training around it? And it's very hard to do that. Some of the more advanced companies that we know who are really on board with the whole privacy engineering, for them audit is everything, and that everything needs to have a really strong audit trail. And engineering your system in that way is really important, but it's very difficult for a lot of people to make those shifts.
And maybe to ask my question as well in a bit of a different way, and just to kind of segue it to some of the work that you're doing in innovations in this space around privacy. You know, the ability to do motivated intruder attacks, as an example, is looking at the effectiveness of the controls around data aggregation and de-identification, right?
Sure.
And you know, so we're starting to see that we are now able to do this a lot more systematically, but also demonstrate the auditability and reliability of those processes. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so for that clarification. Yeah, absolutely. And if you're attesting to the efficacy of your model, right? You're trying to figure out, did this anonymization strategy work? Did this technique work? There's definitely ways that you can do that now with technology, and the motivated intruder is certainly one of them. And in the security space, this is a well-known way of doing business, is that something is not secure until you've tested it, until you've ran it through its paces and you had people look at it. In the privacy space, this is still a very new concept.
It is, yeah,
but it's becoming really, really important.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I want to make sure that everybody has time today to get over to Mike Branch, who's doing the keynote in the main stage today within the next little while. So I want to be able to pause here and thank the panelists for what I think is an exceptional conversation today, and open it up to a few minutes for questions if there are any online or here in the room as well.
There's no questions on the live Q&A except for the scavenger code, and that's 1637. So we'll turn it over to the audience now.
Any questions from folks in the audience?
So I found the discussion very interesting, that as a data scientist, you want to find out like the problem, you want to get the raw data at the end, but it's very hard to then make it like private. So you say that there's a step before, which makes it private.
Yeah.
And then the data scientist moves it.
Yeah. So just for folks that are listening in, just to say the question again, Paul has asked, you know, sort of the sequencing, if you will, of when privacy controls get applied to data. You know, is it happening up front? Is it happening while the data scientists are working with the data? Or is it happening after the fact, once the insights have happened? And the sequencing is super important because under the law, and I'll let Nicole chime in to make sure that I'm being held honest here, but you know, getting insights from aggregated and anonymized data, that data by definition is not personal data, right? So the data science efforts that take place with regards to that are fair game in terms of not being subject to privacy laws, okay? So the sequencing of that is super important. So, you know, we would love, you know, to be able to go in and fish and mine and use that raw data, but the reality is the privacy controls need to be applied, at least in my experience, well ahead of time, and sometimes also after the fact as well. So we were talking earlier about context and utility. Yeah. Sometimes that sort of balance that needs to happen around how far is far enough for us still to get value from the data sets themselves, but still also protecting the information. So it's basically a hybrid is what I would propose, but I'll open it up to folks.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different ways to do it. I know that data scientists don't like the idea of privacy protecting the data before they get to use it. I mean, and so I had mentioned earlier, right, like the concept of a data pipeline and where you could apply that privacy protection, and you could anonymize all the data before you ever play with it. And depending on the context, again, it depends on whether that's the right scenario. It could actually work out, and we've talked about this with a number of organizations, as to like, well, you could, if you determine sort of a risk level that your company is, you know, happy with, you could say, okay, you can, as long as you reduce the risk of that, the risk of re-identification of the data that you're working with to, you know, some percentage that they specify, then you can transform the data however you want in order to achieve that, but then also get your analytics. So we could see privacy actually working as part of feature engineering, if you say. So you're like, okay, I'm going to reduce the risk. I'm going to try this transformation. I'm going to build my model. And you go like, oh, what? That didn't work very well. I'm going to go back. But you're always making sure you're getting that risk level right before you do your modeling. So it's one way to work. The other way is to obviously do it ahead of time. But then again, you don't know if you're going to get the right utility until you get to that context.
And in reality, everybody retrofits.
Yeah, right.
Fair enough. Any other questions? I think
we got one from the live chat, so I'll just read it out to you because screens aren't working. So, and maybe this one sounds like it's for you, Nicole, and you know, we can obviously take it offline. But the headline is, what does Geotab have to offer to end users in the way of a privacy policy or a white paper for incorporating into their own policy? So I'm assuming that's, you know, passing it on to resellers and others.
Yeah, there's a couple of mechanisms that we have in place. Certainly, if you go to data.geotab as well as our Geotab website, you'll see our privacy policy. You'll see our TOMS or our security policy and all of the operating procedures that we actually make public through that forum as well. So you can see with great transparency what the technical controls that we have in place around protecting that information that's in our environment. And then we also have, as you probably saw in our sessions yesterday, where we were actually walking through some of the cool innovations that we have on our websites, including our blog, where we actually post a lot of really great insights around what we're doing, white papers and so on, specific to privacy and privacy controls. And that also extends to our data.geotab or Ignition portfolio, where we also have a white paper mechanism there as well to gather additional insights. Great question.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Wellham, VP Compliance with Geotab, and honestly, Nicole's covered it all. We're building more structure around what we've got going on, in particular focused on data privacy as we build out the big data systems. But you've got the big experts there.
And you know, transparency is a fundamental foundation, really, when we're thinking about consumer trust, and privacy is obviously in lockstep with that. And certainly an important part of the conversation, as you've heard here today. So thank you very much for everyone that's joined us, both online as well as here in the room today. Thank you for your mind space, and thank you to our esteemed panelists for being here today as well. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.